Hi, welcome to session 5, Forage and Humanity's Future with Dr. Peter Ballerstedt. If you didn't catch Dr. Ballerstedt's keynote address yesterday, it was awesome, and I'm sure today's topic will be just as good. My name is Luke Wilson with Barenbrug USA, and we are happy to be a sponsor of this year's Spring Forage Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ballerstedt today, and Dr. Ballerstedt received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture in 1981 and his Master of Science in 1983, both from the University of Georgia. He received his PhD from the University of Kentucky in 1986, specializing in forage management and utilization, minoring in ruminant nutrition. Peter has an extensive experience in forage agriculture. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 until 1992. He's been with Barenbrug USA since 2011, first as their forage product manager until 2018, and currently serves as our forage ambassador. His study of human nutrition is fueled by his personal experience. The knowledge combined with his forage background led him to become an advocate for ruminant animal agriculture and the essential role of animal source foods in the human diet. He strives to build bridges between producers and consumers and researchers across a wide variety of scientific disciplines. Peter has spoken at many different events in the US and internationally, and many of these presentations are available on YouTube. Peter and his wife Nancy live in Western Oregon with their 2 dogs, Connor and Noni. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Ballerstedt.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your support of the Southwest Missouri Spring Forage Conference. I'd like to speak to you today in this talk about forages and humanity's future. Might not be a surprise that I want to take this in a little different direction, but for many of the same reasons that I've spoken about before. Once again, I'm going to be sharing my opinion. Shouldn't confuse that necessarily with that of my employers, but I think I'm not too far off the beam on it. Again, just to let you know who's talking to you, I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life. I work for a forage seed company, Barenbrug USA, and I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. Whenever I get the honor of speaking to undergraduate classes, I try to remind myself that 2050 is only 29 years from now, the professional lifetime of today's students. And I like to encourage them to consider careers in forage agriculture or closely related disciplines because they would then have the opportunity to improve the flourishing and well-being of humanity by addressing some of the key issues that we'll be facing between now and 2050. It's been estimated that by 2050, the world's population will reach 9+ billion people from 7.5 today. That will require a doubling of the world's food production. It will be accompanied by a 2/3 increase in demand for animal source protein. And that's, by my estimation, a significant underestimate. Obviously, this all has to come from the same land area that we've got today. We're also going to have to double electrical generating capacity between now and then to meet the developmental needs of humanity in low and middle income countries. And at the same time, we're going to have 70% of humanity living in urban areas by that time. Now, that's maybe even under where we are in the United States now, but we're talking about global population. And I want to make the case that ruminants and forage agriculture are essential. We can't feed today's world without ruminant animal agriculture, let alone this world of 2050 that I've just described. And the challenge is we must improve efficiency and productivity of ruminant animal agriculture, not merely in the high income countries or just in North America, but globally. And so, just as we had to have a green revolution with Professor Borlaug and his colleagues, we need a ruminant revolution. We need the mobilization of public and private resources, the political will to do the work necessary to conduct the research and apply the findings globally so that we can achieve that increase in productivity and efficiency. Now, part of this is we've got to get our minds right, and perspective matters. And if you only live in the high income countries, things look very different in the low and middle income countries. And we can actually hear various voices talking about eliminating livestock agriculture, and this is completely impractical. One quote that I used in my talk yesterday, the notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. That these issues, as I said, look very different if you're looking at them from, say, sub-Saharan Africa than if you're in New York City. But as I said, we need to get support and allies, and we need to get more people aware of just how good a story we have in forage and ruminant agriculture. And this quote from Amanda Radke I also used yesterday, but just to make the point that consumers and producers alike care about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, food safety, nutrition, taste. These are things any reasonable person would be concerned about. But depending on your history and your experience and your perspective, you might understand those differently. So one of my roles is to try to build bridges between the communities of consumer and producer and between the disciplines that span the production through consumption space of ruminant animal agriculture. So forage agriculture, we've had many great presentations during this conference that would talk about grazing management, talk about hay management or silage management. These are topics, broad topics that a lot of information is available. There's more research to be done. This information needs to be disseminated more widely than just Western Europe and North America. But I want to take it in a little different direction because forage agriculture is about more than pasture, hay, and silage crop production and utilization. It's also about conservation. Imagine an apple representing the earth. A 30-second wedge, if you could imagine it, of that apple would represent the agricultural land. And the peel of that 30-second represents the soil that everything depends upon. So soil degradation is a significant threat to worldwide human flourishing. When the soils are gone, we too must go unless we find some way to feed on raw rock. People may be entertaining notions of lab-grown meat or plant analogs, but nobody's suggesting that we can start chewing on soil. Of the Earth's total land area, another way to express the apple analogy is of the land area now, 37% can grow food. A quarter of that land area, though, is in perennial forage and rangeland. And frankly, I can defend the case that we really haven't begun to utilize that resource to its potential. And in fact, we probably have to undo some of what we've done over the last couple centuries. Only 12% is suitable for cultivated crops, but those lands can obviously also be in short-term forages, in rotations, short-term pastures, and as we'll see, some other options. So when people entertain this idea of reducing or eliminating animal source food because we could use that land to grow food for human consumption, obviously that's not possible. We also need to accept that we're losing that cultivated or arable land. This one estimate of 20% of it being lost in 40 years from 1960 to 2000, one of the key reasons for that loss is development. We don't tend to build housing developments on the marginal lands. Those tend to go on the class 1 and class 2 soils. So if we're going to talk about sustainability, we need to talk about it from a number of perspectives. And there's a lot of issues that are considered among people who are doing good work in this area, but they don't translate too well over into the public conversation. And I'm interested in true sustainability, not what I call sustainababble. And forages, forage agriculture, ruminant animal agriculture is essential to sustainable development and sustainable food systems. This is unsustainable. Estimates are 24 billion metric tons of topsoil lost due to erosion per year worldwide. So imagine taking the state of Kentucky, removing the top 6 inches of soil every year. Now, we've made improvements in some parts of the world. There's still more work to be done, but this is a key problem in other parts of the world still. So forage agriculture is also conservation. It's also about cover crops and soil health. Many of the species that are being used in the cover crop application are in fact forage varieties or species. In a sense, we're just getting back into integrated cropping systems, which is a good thing. We know the keys to healthy soil: cover the soil with a high plant diversity, minimize mechanical disturbance, grow plants for the maximum days each year, incorporate well-managed ruminants, manage livestock to enhance soil function. This sounds a lot to me like grazing systems and integrating those back into our cropping systems. So this too is forage agriculture. We need to just be aware that, as I say, there's no sustainable food systems without livestock. At least half of the world's cereals come from these mixed farming systems, and a great deal of food is coming from these low and middle income countries with these mixed crop livestock systems. So as we go forward, this is what we must improve. Forage agriculture is also agroforestry or silvopastoral systems where we're growing trees and forage and therefore grazing livestock on the same land. And I think the future is in what some researchers are calling integrated livestock cropping systems. One very recent paper from last year studied an integrated livestock cropping system where the rotation was pasture and soybeans. And what they realized was that by putting the fertilizer on the forage instead of on the soybeans, they produced more food because the pasture was better, the beef yield was better, and the soybean yield was equivalent. More food from the same land with the same or fewer inputs and improved soil health. This is a win, 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 win opportunity. And again, this will be forage agriculture as we go forward. Virgil said that the greatest wealth is health. And I say that we can have healthy people and healthy soils thanks to ruminant animal agriculture. I talked about the healthy people yesterday. There's a few more things that we need to pick up on, but I think it helps make the case for forage agriculture now and in the future. Again, true health food, not the faddish stuff, but the true health food comes from ruminants. All fermented plant products. And it needs to be acknowledged that animal source foods are superior to plant source foods. Too often in the conversations around sustainability and those issues, they're treated as if they're equivalent. And it's just not scientifically correct. Animal source foods are superior to plant source foods as sources of the amino acids and other essential nutrients humans require for proper development and health. Animal source foods contain unique nutrients. They're the only dietary source of retinol, which is the fully formed vitamin A, heme iron, vitamin B12, vitamin D, the highly bioavailable forms of zinc. They're superior sources of protein for human nutrition due to having a complete amino acid profile and that those amino acids are highly digestible. They're the only source of the essential fatty acids, EPA and DHA. You can get those from sea vegetables, but frankly, how many people eat those? And they're sources of unique bioactive compounds like the conjugated linoleic acids, bioactive peptides, amino acids like carnitine. Oh, animal source foods are essential. Livestock source foods are important if the global nutritional, educational, and economic needs are going to be met and can be used to feed the developing countries out of poverty. I love that phrase, feeding the developing countries out of poverty. There's an ambition for a new undergraduate because we understand that cattle contribute directly to global food security. Not just cattle, all ruminants. But in this case, cattle rely on grazing. They actually increase the human protein quality and supply. So ruminants are essential. This upcycling of improving the quality of resources. In the case of most of their diet, it's a resource we can't utilize directly. We don't graze, we don't browse. In other cases, even if it's feed that humans could eat, when we feed it to livestock and ruminants especially, we improve its nutritive value to humans. They're a significant source of income for security and for economic development. Over half of the world's fertilizer that's used to grow human edible crops comes from manure. A significant amount of that is from ruminants. Therefore, it's from forage agriculture. Over half the world's farmers still depend on draft animals. Most of those are ruminants. Ruminants provide ecosystem services beyond the creation of red meat and dairy products. And unfortunately, too many people in the world today are still reliant on burning dirty biofuels for cooking. Something like 1 billion people in the world still rely on burning dung. This creates a tremendous burden from particulate pollution indoors, impacting respiratory health in women and children. Also, the nutrients that were in the dung are lost, so there's another cost. These are issues that we can and should be working to alleviate. Ruminants convert this structural and non-structural carbohydrates into fat. It's essential in the energy flow through the biosystems that they're a part of. They convert plant protein and non-protein nitrogen into highest quality animal source protein. They reduce unstable polyunsaturated fatty acids into more stable monounsaturated and stable saturated fatty acids. They produce, as was mentioned earlier, vitamin B12 and other vitamins. They increase bioavailability of essential minerals. They degrade anti-quality plant components. They maintain the health of grassland ecosystems, ecosystem services. They recycle nutrients and build soil health, another service. They provide services like draft and byproducts like leather, and they generate new wealth. All of these are essential, and no beyond or impossible is offering a suitable substitute. But I can hear people saying, what do you know? You're just a forage agronomist. Well, fair enough. I'm a forage agronomist. I'm also a ruminant nutritionist, so I'd like to point that out. But I do know that when they talk about the global protein supply for humanity, they're talking about crude protein. And I know the difference between crude protein and true protein. When you look on a food label, it says protein, that's crude protein. And the sad thing is that globally, cereals provides more crude protein to humanity's food supply than all animal source foods combined. For the poorest 20% of the tropical population around the world, rice provides more protein per person than beans, meat, or milk. Rice is a really bad protein source. Don't just think that this is something that only occurs in low and middle income countries. Over 40% of Americans don't get enough protein. And most females over the age of 8 don't get enough protein. It's actually worse than this because they're one driving towards the RDA, which is a really low, minimal level of protein intake. And they're treating plant source protein and animal source protein as if they're equivalent. We know they're not. So it's worse than this. Something else I know as a forage agronomist, we've spent a lot of time talking about why we need to test each lot of hay and silage so that we know its accurate nutritional value, because we know that those materials can vary quite a bit in their nutritional value. Well, guess what? All plant source foods vary. Soybeans, based on this one sample of 6,000 soybean samples, crude protein varied by as much as 20% around the mean. And individual amino acids can vary by as much as 45%. Now, when they print a label, they don't print a new label for every batch. You might want to think about that. Number one protein supply for humanity is wheat. Wheat varies quite a bit based on which market class we're talking about. And wheat's a pretty poor protein source as well. There's a new system of protein evaluation called DIAS, Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score. And it is a way to estimate how closely a particular food, whether a single or a complete mixed food, would meet target needs at various ages. And so you can see as humans age from birth to 6 months, 6 months to 3 years, or above 3 years, we get marginally better at utilizing the protein that's in wheat, but still it's pretty poor even as an adult. Lysine is the limiting indispensable amino acid. What's really interesting is when we process that, we make it even worse. You know, when hay heats and you get browning and it reduces the digestibility of the crude protein? Yeah, it's the same thing when we make crunchy breakfast cereal or we make whole wheat bread with a nice crust on it. It's the same process with the same effect. But interestingly, that doesn't happen with animal source foods when we process them. So we should really stop talking about processed plant foods and processed animal foods as if they're the same thing. They are absolutely not. In some cases, we actually improve the DIAS value of the processed product relative to the raw starting animal product. That's kind of interesting because now we have the opportunity to take lower value cuts and improve their nutritive value. And we should maybe rethink how we think about some of these products like all meat hot dogs or Spam or traditional products like jerky. Truth is that for almost 4 decades, swine nutritionists have balanced rations on an essential amino acid content, and more recently worrying about the digestibility of those essential amino acid contents. We're a long way from that in most practice of human nutrition. But this extends further than just, air quotes, human nutrition and health. This misinformation actually extends into modeling of environmental impacts. And in this paper, the authors state the environmental footprint associated with the production of animal versus vegetal protein-containing food products needs to be reevaluated on the basis of the content of essential, and I would say digestible, amino acid in foods. Too often, the whole question of sustainability devolves to only looking at environmental issues and perhaps focusing on the emissions of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And this is really unfortunate. And it further devolves when people cite global figures and apply them to individual countries. Globally, something like a quarter of all emissions per the IPCC are attributed to the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, which doesn't make them the biggest sector, close, but not the biggest. So when we look at the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from the US, we get a very different picture where the agriculture, forestry, and other land use category is 10% of the total. And when we look at the same source, what's interesting is in that document, they acknowledge that the amount of carbon sequestered by that same sector is equivalent to 12% of the total emissions. So already today in the US, the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector is net negative emitter. Wonder why they don't talk about that much. And again, when we look at this comparison between US industrialized nations, the low and middle income developing nations, we see again why we shouldn't compare global figures to individual nations or groups of nations. This is looking at the enteric, that is from the rumen, emissions of methane due to the fermentation that takes place in all ruminants. Just looking at cattle for this, what's remarkable is that in the US, that's the bottom green line. It's been flat since 1961. The other industrialized nations has been trending downward since somewhere in the 70s, perhaps. The increase is coming in the developing nations, where people, as they become more prosperous, they want more animal source food. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. And oh, by the way, I just did the calculations on this. If you look at the total enteric methane emissions from these three groups and compare it to all anthropogenic sources of methane emissions, we're less than 3%, 3.0. Okay, now let's look at cattle specifically. We're now looking at CO2 equivalent. So we've looked at carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous compounds, converted it all into a CO2 equivalent. Global livestock, again, about 14.5%. But frequently, so the first lesson is livestock is 14.5%. All of agriculture was 24%. So don't let them attribute all of agriculture to livestock. Don't let them put all of livestock onto the beef cattle, because the global beef cattle herd is estimated to be responsible for 6%. And of that, the US beef cattle is less than 0.5%. And we have 8% of the global beef cattle herd. This again points to the necessity of improving efficiency. By the way, the IPCC also says that the agriculture, forestry, and land use category is globally today a net negative sector. Again, I wonder why they don't talk about that much. It's in the same document. Some people have tried to estimate what the impact would be of eliminating animal agriculture from the United States. Couple points. They do also include eliminating of pets, and the animals don't get to hang around. So after the world's largest barbecue, we're going to end up with some potential benefits and some potential costs. We need to weigh those whenever we discuss anything to do with food systems, agricultural practices, etc. The reduction of anthropogenic greenhouse gases was estimated by White and Hall in 2017 to be less than 3% of US total, less than 0.4% of global. It's not nothing, but what's the cost? Well, we unbalance our food ecosystem and create essential dietary nutrient deficiencies. Doesn't sound like it's worth it to me. And when you begin to dig deeper, you see that even if we doubled the average consumption of raw boneless trim beef per day, that would represent emissions less than driving a car 2,700 miles a year or taking one commercial round trip flight from JFK to LAX via Denver, let alone private jets. And we're comparing life cycle in the beef to tailpipe emissions, which isn't an apples to apples comparison. So true sustainability, we have to include societal, economic, as well as environmental issues. So now let me leverage what I talked about yesterday, what's been mentioned already, and pose a question. What if the burden of chronic diseases, which are mostly metabolic, and globally they're the largest cause of death and the driver of healthcare and associated costs, what if they could be dramatically reduced? Why don't we ask what are the impacts of the healthcare and pharma industries? What if the health effects of what we eat has a greater environmental impact than the food we eat does? Surprisingly, our analysis reveals that the pharmaceutical industry is significantly more emission intensive than the automobile industry. US healthcare sector was also responsible for significant fractions of national air pollution emissions, including 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Somebody remind me, please, how much does beef produce? Sometimes I just can't resist the snark. Both professions wear white coats, which produces more greenhouse gases. US animal agriculture, 4%, beef alone, 2%, US healthcare system, 10%. What if eating more of the animal source foods lessened our need for the healthcare system? Well, here's an example. The average American with type 2 diabetes uses pharmaceuticals equal to 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. If the average American diabetic could eliminate their medication use, they would reduce their CO2 equivalent or carbon footprint 29% more than if they switched from a high meat to a vegan diet. If their use of those diabetes-specific pharmaceuticals was eliminated, it could result in a reduction of almost 50 million metric tons CO2 equivalent per year. Okay, what's that? Well, that's the carbon sequestered by more than 65 million acres of forest in 1 year. What's that? Well, that would be an area of forest that would be the 9th largest state in the US between Colorado and Oregon, or the 76th largest country in land area, larger than the United Kingdom. That's a little better than less than 3% or the 0.4% from eliminating animal agriculture. We've got to get better at telling our story. So, okay, sounds like I'm speculating wildly. Well, no, actually, there's well-established now research literature based showing that type 2 diabetes is in fact reversible, and that type 2 diabetes is but one of the metabolic illnesses that I discussed yesterday. The leading causes of death in the United States, we need to start thinking of these as part of hyperinsulinemia. Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the US. But what percent of the other 9 leading causes is due to hyperinsulinemia? Heart disease? Yes. Cancer? Yes. Chronic respiratory disease? It plays a part. Stroke? Yes. Alzheimer's disease? Yes. Kidney disease? Yes. So there's a significantly greater amount of impact by following this course as well. What percent of healthcare is the result of that burden? The majority. What are the potential emissions reductions if these burdens could be lifted? Significant. Something else I try to tell people who are very concerned about improving the world in various ways is that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And it may be the most impactful and practical thing that most people can do. And again, I think we in forage agriculture, ruminant animal agriculture in general, have a very good story that if we could form bridges with the consuming public and the people who are working in these other areas of research, we could tell that story in a way that would reach more people and shift a lot of the public debate. I mentioned yesterday ways that you could reach me through my Twitter account at barusa_Peter, or my email account at pballerstead, no punctuation, at barusa.com. I'm happy to share my sources, my slides, help you develop materials to help you encourage people to become advocates for forage agriculture in humanity's future. Thank you, and let's see if we have time for questions.
Peter, great to have you back today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Wonderful presentation that you had there. Really enjoyed a lot of the aspects that you had to show. Really appreciate your output and really your interest in trying to help expand the food system.
Well, I've benefited from the people I've worked with, the people that trained me. I'm looking forward to those that are coming after. We have some real challenges in the world, and I think forage agriculture has the best story and the best potential to meet those challenges.
Well, I got a question here kind of along those lines. What are your thoughts on Bill Gates' most recent claim that more developed countries need to start eating synthetic meat to combat climate change?
I think that Mr. Gates is sadly misinformed and badly advised. understand that he's making investments. So part of what he's doing is he's market developing. But the simple fact is that livestock agriculture is not, let alone only beef, but all of livestock agriculture is not a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions as a source. And then all the evidence shows that it is in fact a sink for greenhouse gas emissions. And if we were to try, it's not possible, but if we were to try to replace ruminant animal agriculture or beef alone with the plant source food that we'd have to use, we would create imbalances in our food system, we would produce more emissions, and we would probably exacerbate malnutrition.
I think that's definitely something, a lot of very good points in there. You know, the more soybeans you take out of the ground, the more diesel you're going to have to burn. I think that those imbalances probably do shine through negatively. So a lot of comments about, you know, thank you for the good scientific info. They really appreciate that side of you bringing out the truth to us today.
And I want to offer, extend the invitation. I'm happy to help people find and use the information that I've been given from all these researchers doing this work so that we can, again, tell the story to a wider audience. So I'm happy to collaborate with people to try to expand this and welcome the opportunity.
Another question just come in here. How can we encourage people that grain protein isn't equivalent to meat protein and that both are actually needed to be in your diet?
Yeah, there's some really good work that's being done now on this DIAS score, this digestible indispensable amino acid score system for evaluating protein in human nutrition. And when that is fully incorporated, people will understand why animal source food is superior to plant source food. I think, again, we just need to push back whenever we have the opportunity. We just need to make sure that this information is available for more people to understand. There's been several decades head start from some misinformation, so it's going to take some time. But I think more and more people are discovering that when they eat animal source protein, they feel better, they're healthier, they perform better than when they try to do that from plant sources alone. And one of the examples that we could offer people is our experience testing hay and how much that varies in just crude protein content. Well, when you see protein on a food label, it's a crude protein value. And if we go to plant source foods, they vary just like hay varies, and they don't print a new label every time they run a new batch. And so it's again, I think that we know things from our daily activities in animal agriculture that if we could find ways to express those to a wider audience, I think they make sense to people once we figure out how to do that.
Absolutely. Well, very good points in there. Very good points in there. Efficiency, a lot about efficiency, kind of going into your talk from yesterday as well. So again, some other comments. Glad this is actually recorded. I know you have a copy. Look forward to seeing it out there most likely and getting that out to the masses. So again, it's been wonderful to have a conversation with you off screen here. Very inspirational man. Appreciate that. Look forward to more work from you. Encourage anybody that has more questions to reach out to you as everything's in the proceedings. And thank you again for coming and talking with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for sitting in that chair for 2 days.
No problem. Again, we want to encourage everybody to fill out an eval. If you would, please get that done for us. It's the future of our conference. Thank you.